Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Odin's Movie Blog. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we'll be looking ahead to this weekend's box office by looking at some box office tracking and forecasting, specifically that for Rise of Skywalker, and also for a new wide release that is 1917. That is currently my most anticipated film of the year so far. Obviously, I've got a lot of other anticipated films on my list. You can go out check out a previous video I did on that, but since 1917 technically was a 2019 release, that film is not going to be on that list, but I've been wanting to see this film ever since I saw the first trailer, ever since I found out the people behind the project and just the concept of them doing it all and making it look like one take. It just looks really cool, and apparently because of a lot of the Golden Globes nomination and a lot of the BAFTA and all the Guild Award nominations for 1917, it's getting a lot of really nice positive buzz in Hollywood, and they're getting some pretty good TV spots as well, so it looks like that film is going to get a nice little box office opening and is now set to beat The Rise of Skywalker, the box office, which will be entering into its fourth week. But before it enters into its fourth week, let's look at the current numbers for The Rise of Skywalker, which has now reached $945 million. Many suspect that it'll end around 980 to around $1 billion, $10 million by the end of the weekend. So we'll see how those numbers fall. The box office numbers and the box office estimates for its fourth weekend are really not all that impressive, especially when you compare it to previous films in the franchise, but we'll get to that in just a second. So $945 million, let's go ahead and compare that to the dailies of both The Last Jedi and Rogue One: A Star Wars Story. As we can see, Rogue One is still now very much, when you adjust for inflation, still very much ahead of where The Rise of Skywalker is. Rise of Skywalker has now made $460 million here domestically, making it seem ever more likely that the film is barely going to break the $500 million mark here in the domestic marketplace. Will definitely not get to the $620 million that The Last Jedi eventually made at the end of its run, and in all likelihood, when adjusted for inflation, and even we're getting to the point now, especially if the weekend happens the way that we suspect, could potentially even fall even further behind what the Rogue One did prior to adjusting for inflation as well. What is interesting to me is when you not just compare the day-to-day numbers, but the weekend comparisons as well. So far, we've only got 3 weekends, so this is where the story really starts to come to play. So opening weekend for Rise of Skywalker was $177 million versus The Last Jedi, which was $220, versus the $155 million for Rogue One. But remember, that is before you adjust for inflation, meaning that Rogue One: A Star Wars Story had a better opening weekend than The Rise of Skywalker did. I think that speaks quite a heavy amount of volume. Looking to the second weekend. Second weekend, Rise of Skywalker made $72 million because it did not have a massive drop-off like The Last Jedi did, which made $71 million versus the $64 million of Rogue One: A Star Wars Story. But once again, Rogue One's adjusted for inflation numbers make that the film to really look to. I'm actually very upset with myself that I didn't do that comparison prior to, because if I had looked to those numbers for Rogue One and had done the adjustments for inflation, I would have been able to pick up earlier on. So kudos to the people that were throwing that information my way, that Rogue One really is the movie to look at as far as what is likely going to happen with the numbers for Rise of Skywalker. But here we are. And as you can see, it was doing well in the second weekend and then had another massive drop-off to $34 million, falling well behind the $52 million of The Last Jedi, and before inflation, the $49 million of the third weekend. And now here is where the story gets incredibly interesting, and that is, of course, this upcoming fourth weekend. So in the fourth weekend of release, The Last Jedi made $23 million. Rogue One didn't do that far off, making $22 million. Now, of course, you have to adjust that for inflation, and it's still, obviously, since these are only a year, I know this is exciting, guys. I know you love box office numbers as much as I do, but these movies are only a year apart from each other, so the difference in the box office really isn't going to be all that much when you adjust for inflation, or at least not nearly as much as when you compare it to the numbers for Rise of Skywalker. But here's what the interesting part is. When you look to the forecast for this weekend, and this is the current forecast, so 1917 is indeed set to make $36 million for the 3-day forecast, which is a very strong opening. Obviously, the film has been out for a while in a limited marketplace, so you can see it's got a 5,821% increase change from last weekend, but that's because it was in almost no theaters then and is now going to be in, I think, over 3,000 theaters now, so it's getting a pretty big bump. It's getting a lot of buzz, so it's set to come in very well in first place, not any real competition behind it. Coming in second place is Rise of Skywalker, Skywalker, which, as I keep making the point, is only going to be $2 million behind, is only going to be $2 million rather ahead of Jumanji 3. I mean, the fact that the Jumanji 3 has been out for an extra week and is still percentage-wise performing so much better than Rise of Skywalker speaks so many volumes to me. It is projected, Rise of Skywalker, to have a 51% drop from last weekend, but here's the problem. It was projected to have a 49% drop the previous weekend, and the drop ended up actually being higher. It actually ended up being around 52, 53%. So if the projected drop is 51%, and if Rise of Skywalker makes less than the 16.8, and keep in mind, that is for the 3-day total, that means that this movie will have yet another over 50% drop-off, and the legs of the film will continue to plummet. But that is not the most interesting part. So remember this number, $16.8 million in its fourth weekend. Well, look at that and how that compares to the previous Star Wars films, Last Jedi and Rogue One. So it's expected to make $16 million. At the same weekend, in that fourth weekend, The Last Jedi made $23 million, Rogue One made $22 million. So as I showed you, after this weekend, Rogue One will probably be, unless, of course, we look to the dailies and the dailies. But right now, adjusted for inflation, the dailies are still putting Rogue One ahead. But it's even close before you adjust for inflation as well. There is a chance that after this weekend, if it only makes 16 and maybe even makes less than 16 million this weekend, that Rogue One will have a higher, at this time in history, domestic box office prior to adjustment for inflation than Rise of Skywalker. So what does that tell us? To me, that tells us that the legs have dropped off this thing tremendously. If it only hits 16 million in this fourth weekend, and in the fifth, sixth, and seventh weekends, we've got more films with more competition coming out, and the consistent 50% drop, which is now going to be the second or third time that that's happened in a row, second or third weekend in a row, we've seen that kind of level of a drop. Can you honestly say that in the fifth weekend, it's going to match the $13 million that Rogue One made? Rogue One ended up reaching $1 billion because it had very strong legs after its release. It made 13, 7, 5, 2, 1, well above what was being made by The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi did not have very good leads. It made all of its money in the very beginning and then dropped off pretty hard. The Last Jedi, or rather The Rise of Skywalker, made some money in its opening weekend, had a very strong Christmas Day showing, and then has dropped off a cliff. So this is once again a showing that Rise of Skywalker is by no means a huge financial success. Yes, it is in the black. Yes, it is making money according to my estimates, but still, Rogue One, a Star Wars story, being a film that in the lexicon and in the history books of Star Wars is going to be a not only higher grossing raw total, but also a more profitable film than the ninth film in the Skywalker saga that really should be doing endgame numbers, is not anything that can be ignored. But I am excited to see what's going to happen with 1917. You also have a new release, Like a Boss, which is expected to make $12.8 million. Little Women is still doing very strong with $10 million. Just Mercy gets a wider release, making $8.4. Frozen 2 continues to make money for some reason. Underwater by Fox, which remember is owned by Disney now, is set to not do well with 6.5. I'll have to look at the box office breakdown for that and look at the budget and everything to see just how good or bad that is. Knives Out is still making money for some damn reason. Spies in Disguise continues to flop. But these are the projections for this coming weekend. And of course, the big story is that 1917 is going to be the first film to bump off a Star Wars film. Yes, it's out in its fourth weekend, so this is definitely not the worst case scenario. If it had been bumped out in the previous weekends, that would definitely be worse. But what is a very bad number is that in its fourth weekend, it's going to make 16.8 versus the 23 and 22 million made by previous films. It is impossible now at this point, now that you have 2 weekends in a row of massive drop-offs and you have terrible comparisons between the previous movies, especially a movie that was not a part of the episodic saga, that was not a part of the that was not one of those a part of the Star Wars saga films, the 9-film arc that started back in 1977. It's just really sad. It is sad that we are in the current place that we are. It's sad that we have a Star Wars film that's doing this poorly. And yes, it is doing poorly, no matter how you spin it. Even if a film is profitable, that does not make the film good. Even if a film is profitable, it does not mean that that is what the story of this film is going to be by the end. Look at how Rogue One had 20 weekends being in the box office making money because of how successful it was down the line. The Last Jedi only was able to get to 18 weekends. With this type of drop drop-off with these type of numbers, we're looking at a situation where the Rise of Skywalker might crap out around, hell, 14 or 15 weeks. And if that happens, you can kiss any chance of it beating films like Joker or getting that much above 1.1 billion aside. Now, I know some people are trying to push the conspiracy. Oh, Disney's going to buy tickets to push it over the edge. I don't buy into that nonsense. But the fact remains, these numbers don't lie. These numbers are very clear. People are not seeing this movie, are not seeing Star Wars in the same numbers that they were previously. Something is wrong. And Disney needs to look at these numbers very closely. 16 million in the fourth weekend versus 22 for Rogue One of all films. They need to look at that very carefully and say to ourselves, what the hell did we do wrong? Find that the answer is obviously Kathleen Kennedy, Rian Johnson, and do something about it. But kudos to 1917 because it looks like it's going to have a very strong start. But what are your thoughts about it? Do you think it's going to be a 51% drop in its fourth weekend, or do you think it's going to make under the 16 million that it is projected to make? And also, what do you think the final numbers are going to be versus Rogue One? Do you think that you're going to have to adjust for inflation in order for Rogue One to beat Rise of Skywalker? Or do you think that Rogue One could potentially... Because let's see, it ended its domestic box office at 532. Do you think, that's before inflation, do you think that the domestic box office for Rise of Skywalker will be underneath this total before inflation? I think the days that go by seem to indicate it is very likely to happen. Also, please keep in mind that the OMB Wednesday Raven Award nominations are still live. So if you want to vote for your favorite and least favorite movies and people of 2019, make sure you check out the links in the description to find that ballot. Also, please check out the Patreon. Check out the Subscribe Star. You get a lot of extra bonus stuff from the channel. And also, you help to support the channel and allow me to continue to do what I do. I do have a day job, but being able to get that little bit of extra income allows me to keep on doing it. And I'm trying to do more content for 2020 as well. So even just buying a t-shirt from the store, that way you get something get something physical out of it, that can be beneficial as well. So please check out the links and think about supporting the channel in those ways. If you like this video, smash the like button, give me a subscribe, it helps me a lot. You're all amazing, beautiful people. Have a wonderful day. And as always, God bless.